A ventilator alarm is one thing. A silence that changes shape is another. On the fourth floor of Cascade Ridge Regional, a machine that had said the same flat sentence for 131 days said something different at 3:02 in the morning, and the only person on the unit who heard it was a night shift nurse everyone had already decided to ignore. They called her thorough, which in that building was not a compliment. What none of them knew was where she had learned to hear the thing underneath the silence, or what it would cost the hospital when she refused to stop listening. If this already has you leaning in, stay with me. Let's begin. Rain came off the Pacific and found the town of Aldous, Oregon, the way it always did, sideways, and without apology, drumming the tin awnings over the loading dock behind the old lumber mill and turning the parking structure at Cascade Ridge Regional into a gray box that smelled of wet concrete and diesel. Reyes Delacroix parked in the same corner. She always took third-level nose, out the habit of someone who liked to be able to leave in a hurry, even when there was no reason to. She sat for a moment with the engine ticking and the wipers off watching water sheet down the windshield, and she let the sound of it settle her, the way it had settled her for years. Rain on a metal roof was the first thing that ever told her a body could rest. She had learned that on a boat a long way from Oregon, and she had never quite unlearned it. She was 40 minutes early for a shift she was not required to be early for. She told herself she was waiting out the worst of the rain. She was not waiting out the rain. She was thinking about room 407. Junie Cho had been in 407 for 131 days. She was 24. She was the daughter of Rear Admiral Everett. Cho retired 31 years in the Navy, a decade of it, with a SEAL team whose deployments did not appear in any account he was willing to give. Now the Admiral spent most of his waking hours in a recliner the staff had wheeled in from the family lounge, reading aloud to a daughter the neurology service had declared to be in a persistent, vegetative state, following an anoxic brain injury. He read from whatever the gift shop carried. Lately, it had been a battered paperback about a lighthouse keeper, which Reyes thought was either the saddest thing she had ever seen or the most stubborn, and she had never been able to decide which. The Admiral did not talk much. He was a wide, still man in his early 60s, close-cropped gray hair forearms that looked like they had been poured rather than grown, and eyes that catalogued a room the second he entered it and never stopped. He nodded when staff came in. He nodded when they left. He tracked everything, and he asked for nothing. And Reyes had come to understand that a man like that didn't ask, because asking had a cost he had learned to pay in other currencies. The neurology team led by Dr. Warwick Selby, chief of the service, had assessed Junie at 30 days, at 60, at 90. 3 times the same conclusion. 3 times the same clean paragraph, signed and filed and used gently to encourage the Admiral toward what the social worker called next steps. He had not taken any next steps. He had turned a page. Reyes finished the coffee she had told herself she was drinking, which was cold, and which she drank anyway, and she went in. She had been a nurse at Cascade Ridge for 3 years. Before that, she had been a Navy hospital corpsman for 9, attached to a Marine unit for 2 of those deployments, and to a coastal patrol element for the last one, the one she almost never described to anyone. She came home from that one with a medical discharge, a 2-inch scar over a sliver of titanium in her left wrist, and 2 fingertips on her left hand that had stopped reporting temperature altogether, so that she checked bathwater and IV lines with her right hand out of habit now. She also came home with a particular way of looking at patients that her co-workers found either impressive or exhausting, depending on the day. She noticed things. She wrote them down. She asked questions attendings did not enjoy being asked. She was good at her job. She was not popular, and she had made a kind of peace with the fact that in a hospital that treated its own hierarchy with more reverence than it treated some of its patients, those 2 things were rarely the same. The 4th floor at shift change had a rhythm that looked like chaos to anyone standing outside it, and was in fact a system if you knew how to read it. Hand-off medications vitals the low churn of a unit running just under the line of what its staffing could bear. Reyes moved through it the way she always did, economical 3 steps ahead, already reconstructing the day out of the night nurse's report. She passed 407 twice before she stopped. The second time she stopped because the monitor through the observation window looked wrong to her, and she could not immediately say why, which was exactly the kind of thing she had trained herself never to walk past. The Admiral looked up from the lighthouse book when she came in. He did not say anything. He had learned over 4 months that Reyes Delacroix came into the room without an agenda and left without making promises, and so he gave her the space without comment. She checked the lines. She checked Junie's positioning, the input and output log, the settings on the pumps. She did all of it fast and clean. Then she stood at the foot of the bed and simply watched, which was not on any task list and was the most important thing she did all morning. There was something in the way Junie's left hand lay against the blanket, a faint inward curl to the index finger that had not been in the overnight note. Reyes reached out with 2 fingers of her right hand and touched the back of that hand very lightly. Nothing. She waited. Nothing. She made a note in the chart, replaced it in the door pocket, and left the Admiral to his lighthouse without disturbing him. She told herself it was probably nothing. She did not entirely believe it, and she had learned to respect the part of herself that did not. By late morning, she had charted 4 patients, helped turn a heavy man in 411 without wrenching her wrist, and had a short, tired argument with the charge nurse, Priya Alvarez, about whether Reyes's assessments were adding complexity a short-staffed unit could not afford. "You flagged the CHO chart again," Priya said. She had the voice of a woman who had been having variations of this conversation for 20 years and had run out of new ways to have it. "I noted an observation. An observation neurology will read and close in about the time it takes to spell your name. Then it takes them that long. It still goes in the chart." Priya gave her a long, level look. "I'm going to say this because I actually like you, Reyes. That family is in the worst place a family can be. Selby's assessed her 3 times, putting things in the record that read maybe like a door that isn't really open, that's not kindness. That's the opposite of it." Reyes met the look. "I'm not writing, maybe. I'm writing what I saw. There's a line between those 2 things. I know exactly where it is." She walked away before it could keep going, because she had learned the hard way that some conversations only ended when one person stopped feeding them, and she preferred to be that person. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine drift, and somewhere down past the mill, the low horn of a barge working up the sound carried through the wet air and into the stairwell, where she stood for a second longer than she needed to. The sound went straight through her, the way it always did hooking something old. She let it pass. Then she went to find her afternoon patients, and she did not go back to 4:07, and she told herself that was the appropriate professional distance. She did not know yet that she would break it before the night was out. Dr. Warwick Selby kept his office on the 2nd floor, which suited him because the 2nd floor was as far from the wards as a person could get without leaving the building, and it was closest to the administrative wing, where the decisions that mattered to his career were actually made. He was 59, had published more than most departments produced in a decade, and had chaired neurology at Cascade Ridge for 9 years. By any measure a person could put on paper, he was excellent. He was also the specific kind of excellent that hardens over enough years of being right into something that stops checking whether it still is. He was unfailingly polite. Selby was polite the way a door is polite when it closes on a soft hinge, and underneath the courtesy, there was something he had learned to keep out of professional settings and had never learned to actually manage. Reyes submitted a formal consultation request, the proper way through the electronic system, her documented observations attached. She used clinical language, which she was good at. She did not editorialize. She stated what she had seen, cited the Times, and requested review. The answer came back the next morning, relayed through Priya in the flat prose of a form response. The neurology team had reviewed the nursing notation and found no clinical basis for further intervention. The patient's condition was consistent with prior assessments. The notation had been acknowledged and filed. Reyes read it at the station. She read it twice. Then she set the tablet down and went to check her other patients because she had expected the answer and had not expected it to land the way it did. For 4 days, she did exactly what she was assigned, and nothing more. She charted thoroughly, managed her load, drove home through the mill road. In the dark, slept badly, came back. She did not go into 407 beyond her care duties. She told herself this was correct. On the 5th day, the Admiral stopped her in the corridor. He was a man who chose his moments, and he had chosen this one, waiting until she was between the medication room and the main flow of traffic, standing with the straightness that some people who have worn a uniform for decades never fully set down. Nurse Delacroix. Sir. They tell me you flagged my daughter's chart more than once. She kept her face even. I documented some observations, and they told me it was a nursing note, that it didn't change anything. He studied her. I'm asking what you think. She was quiet a beat because she understood the weight of the question and what her answer could cost him if she was wrong and what it would cost her either way. I think she's responding to something the scheduled assessments aren't built to catch, she said carefully. The responses aren't consistent. They don't show on every pass, which is part of why they get dismissed. But I've seen enough of them now that I don't think they're artifact. The Admiral's jaw moved once, not with feeling, with the controlled processing she recognized in people who had learned to hold themselves together, where falling apart was not an available option. You know what they told me at 60 days? I can guess. Time to think about quality of life. He said the phrase the way you say a word someone else has worn smooth. They were kind about it. There was a pamphlet. He looked at her. What do you need? Time, and permission to go to her care team directly, not through a chart flag, a conversation. He held her gaze for a long moment. You'll have it. The conversation with Selby happened 2 days later and ran about 11 minutes, which was how long it took him to conclude politely and thoroughly that Reyes's observations were the product of what he called caregiver pattern seeking, the tendency of staff who spend extended time with unresponsive patients to read intention into random motor activity. He cited 3 papers from memory, which was impressive, and he cited them with the ease of a man who had won this kind of argument for years. I understand the pull of it, he said. Truly. These cases are draining. The family on the floor every day, the length of it that creates an attachment that can quietly compromise objectivity. I'm not attached to this patient, Reyes said, which wasn't entirely true and was true enough for the room. The observations are time-stamped, detailed, and consistent across 19 separate encounters over 3 weeks. Selby paused just briefly. The consistency of your observations establishes a pattern in the observer, not in the patient. It establishes a pattern in a trained observer, she said, which is the first step in finding out whether there's one in the patient. He looked at her with an expression that was fully professional and had something running under it, the thing that lives just below irritation when a person is managing it hard. Nurse Delacroix, I appreciate that you're thorough. The floors told me as much. But we have 3 comprehensive evaluations. Imaging, EEG, clinical scoring. What you're describing does not appear in that data, because the evaluations are scheduled, she said. Set times, controlled environment, a fixed stimulus protocol. The responses I'm seeing happen during unstructured contact. Different voice, different distance, different. We use standardized protocols for a reason. I know. I'm not saying the protocol is wrong. I'm saying it might be insufficient for this specific patient. Silence. He folded his hands on the desk. I'll be direct because I think it's more respectful than the alternative. You're a nurse. Your observation is one data point, and in this case, many data points from specialists all point the same way. Redirect your energy to your assigned patients. That's my honest advice. She kept her hands still at her sides. I have 3 weeks of handwritten notes. If I submit them formally, will the team review them as a body of evidence, not a chart flag? Submit whatever you like through the proper channels. Everything receives appropriate consideration. She left, knowing exactly what appropriate consideration meant, and she kept her breathing level in the elevator on the way up. What she had not told him, because she had not wanted to hand him another reason to dismiss her, was where she had seen this before. Not in a textbook. On a patrol boat in the Gulf, a 19-year-old machinist's mate, coded non-recoverable, after a blast, showing exactly the quality of response Junie Cho was showing now. Brief, inconsistent, tethered to specific sound, rather than broad stimulus. A senior corpsman had flagged him for continued evaluation instead of withdrawal, because she saw the same thing. That corpsman had been Reyes's mentor. The machinist's mate had opened his eyes 11 days later and gone home to Ohio. She thought about him that night when she went back into 407 after the trays were cleared and the floor had gone quiet. The Admiral was asleep in the recliner, the lighthouse book open on his chest. She did not wake him. She stood by the bed, and low matter of fact, she talked the way she sometimes did with long-haul patients, because she had seen enough to know the inside of an unresponsive body was not always as empty as the chart said. She mentioned the rain. She mentioned that the elevator on the east wing was finally fixed, and maintenance would not shut up about it. She was watching Junie's face when she said the Admiral's name and his daughter's together in a plain register, the kind of sentence with no medical logic behind it that had worked twice in her notes. "Junie, your dad's right here." The left index finger moved, not a twitch. A slow, deliberate curl held, then released, and the monitor logged a single spike gone in under 3 seconds. Reyes reached into her breast pocket, and her hand closed around the thing she always kept there. A worn field triage card, the aluminum edges rubbed soft from years of her thumb, and she pressed it flat against her sternum for a second, the way she always did when she needed her own heart rate to come down. Then she took out her pen and wrote. She was still writing when the door opened behind her. Dr. Selby stood in the doorway. Behind him were 2 people from nursing administration and Priya Alvarez, and the expression on his face told her this was not a social visit. "Nurse Delacroix," he said in the careful voice he used when he wanted witnesses. "I'm told you've been conducting informal assessments in this room outside your assigned duties." She closed the card into her palm. "I've been providing nursing care. At 2300 without a documented assignment." The Admiral was awake. He had come up out of sleep fast and quiet the way people do when they have trained themselves never to be caught fully off guard, and he was watching from the recliner with his hands flat on his knees. "I asked her to check on my daughter," he said. His voice was level. Selby turned to him with something that tried to be deference and fell short of it. "Admiral Cho, I understand. But there are protocols." "There are," the Admiral said. "And this nurse has been the most careful person on this floor for 3 weeks. If that's a problem, I'd like to hear what the problem is." Selby turned back to her instead. "Your access to this room for anything outside a formal assignment is suspended as of now. Any further documentation regarding this patient's neurological status goes through the reporting structure only." A pause. "This will also be noted in your file." She held his eyes. "The spike on the monitor tonight will be reviewed by the on-call resident, who will decide whether it has clinical significance." His face said what his voice would not. The decision had already been made. "Good night, Nurse Delacroix." She walked out. She went to the break room, sat in the plastic chair by the window that looked over the parking structure, and opened her notes to the first page dated 22 days back, and read straight through to the end. 19 responses. 19 documented instances inconsistent on the surface, consistent in the conditions that produced them. Low ambient sound, a familiar voice, personal address, rather than clinical stimulus. She had spent 9 years making calls with no imaging, no specialist on call, no time for a second opinion. She had learned to trust what she saw and to carry the weight of being wrong. She was not wrong about Junie Cho. She let her hands unclench. Then she went back to her other patients and finished her shift. The rain had stopped by the time she drove the Mill Road home, and the sky over the Sound had gone the flat pewter that came before dawn. She kept the radio off. She thought about a machinist's mate from Ohio and about a corpsman named Chief Petty Officer Nadia Okonkwo, who had a way of seeing the thing under the surface that other people missed, and who had taught Reyes the single most important thing she knew. She had been 22 the year she met the Chief Green as Springwood, and Okonkwo had taken one look at her and said the job of a corpsman was not to be brave. It was to stay in the room after everyone else had decided there was no point. Okonkwo said it the way she said, everything flat. No drama, the important word, landing last. Reyes had watched her do exactly that in a compartment full of smoke off the coast. Kneeling by a sailor, 2 other people had already written off, working with the calm of someone who had decided the odds were not her concern. The sailor lived. Okonkwo never mentioned it again. The blast that put the titanium in Reyes's wrist came at the end of that last deployment. An IED in a beached skiff their boarding element had gone to inspect. She remembered the pressure wave more than the sound, the way the air turned solid, and then wasn't there the way she came up, already reaching for the man beside her, before she registered her own hand wasn't working right. She had run a triage line for 40 minutes on a wrist that turned out to be full of fragments, and she had not felt any of it until the adrenaline let go. That was the thing nobody told you about the reflex Okonkwo built into her. Her hands shook now sometimes when the memory came up unbidden. They did not shake when there was a body in front of her that needed them. The order of that had always seemed backward to her, and she had stopped expecting it to make sense. She got home, slept 4 hours, and spent the time before her next shift, photographing every page of her notes and building them into a single document, dated chronological, with a 1-page clinical summary in the front, because whoever read it needed to move through it fast and come out the other side with a clear picture. She showed up 10 minutes early. Priya was at the station. Priya looked at her, then very deliberately away, which meant Priya already knew about the file notation and was communicating her position through the grammar of eye contact. Reyes had been reassigned. Her 4th-floor load was redistributed. She was on the 3rd floor now, General Internal Medicine Discharge Prep Medication Management. On paper, it was not punitive. It was a floor below 407 and 3 specialties away from neurology. She took the assignment without a word clocked in and did the work. She was good at it, even with her head somewhere else, which it was continuously in the specific way a problem with a moving deadline produces a low background pressure that never quite lets go. At 9:40 between medication rounds, she stepped into the 3rd-floor break room because a man was already sitting there who did not belong to the 3rd floor. He was in his 50s, weathered in the way of people who have spent real time outdoors, and not by choice. A canvas coat gone dark at the cuffs, a wristband from the emergency department still on him. He had a paper cup of coffee he was holding for the warmth rather than drinking, and he was looking at the window with the particular stillness of a man used to being asked to move along. "You lost?" she said, not unkindly. "Waiting on a ride that isn't coming," he said. "They discharged me. I'm going." He didn't move. She looked at him a second longer than she needed to. Old frostbite scarring on the fingers. A tremor that was not neurological, she thought, but the kind that came from a body that had been cold too many nights in a row. On his coat, half hidden under the collar, a faded unit patch she recognized. "First of the 5th, she said. "Marines." He looked up surprised. "Long time ago. I know the feeling." She set her own coffee down next to his. "The cafeteria stopped serving the hot stuff at 10. If you're going to wait on a ride that isn't coming, you should wait on it with something in your stomach. Tell them Delacroix sent you. They'll sort you out." He studied her the way careful people study a kindness, checking it for a hook. He didn't find one. "You Navy, Corpsman," he almost smiled. "Figures. You've got the look, like you're counting exits." He stood slower than he wanted to, and she watched the knee that gave him trouble and filed it. "Name's Boyd." "Reyes." She held the door. "Cafeteria's left, then left. Don't let them rush you." He went. She did not know yet that Boyd would end up mattering, that the thing he had noticed in his weeks drifting through the edges of Cascade Ridge would turn out to be a small, ugly piece of a much larger pattern. Right now, he was just a cold man she'd sent toward a hot meal which cost her nothing and was the kind of nothing that made up the whole texture of a good day. She washed her hands and went back to her patients. Her work phone buzzed against her hip as she was hanging an IV. She finished the line before she checked it. It was from the Admiral. "Delacroix." She did it again. On the monitor. "The resident is calling it machine error, and they've moved something up." She read it twice, standing in the doorway of a stranger's room with the rain starting again against the glass, and she felt the floor of the day tilt under her. A second message came through before she could type anything back. They rescheduled the donation evaluation. It was 3 weeks out. Now it's 11 days. Selby signed off tonight. Rhea set the phone face down on the med cart and finished hanging the line, because the patient in front of her did not know or care what was happening 2 floors up, and her hands did the work while the rest of her ran the math. A cluster response shows up on the monitor. Within the hour, an administrative directive comes down to accelerate the evaluation, and the response itself is simultaneously being logged as equipment artifact. 3 things arriving that close together did not read to her like coincidence. She excused herself to the break room, locked eyes with the clock, and pulled up the electronic record, which still flagged updates on any patient she had previously documented, because her notes were still in Junie's chart. The notice was there in plain system language. The donation assessment for Junie Cho had been advanced at the request of the transplant coordination team, pending final neurological sign-off. 11 days. She thought about the machinist's mate from Ohio who had opened his eyes on day 11. She did not text the Admiral back with anything reassuring, because there was nothing useful she could put in a text that would change what was happening in that room right now, and because she needed a plan before she needed to comfort anyone. She wrote him 1 line. "On my way to think this through. Hold." Then she went back to her 3rd-floor patients and worked the rest of the round on 2 tracks, one doing the job correctly, and the other turning the problem over and over looking for the seam. The problem was not Selby. Selby was a symptom. The problem was a system that had made a determination and built momentum around it. Scheduling, paperwork coordination, a timeline, and systems with momentum were not stopped by individual objections. They were stopped by something of equal or greater authority inserted at the right point. She was a floor nurse with a file notation and a document full of observations that had already been formally dismissed. She was by any measure not the right point of insertion. She was the one who was here. At the end of the shift, she did not drive home. She sat in the parking structure with the engine off and the rain coming down, and she made a call she had been circling all afternoon. The Admiral answered on the first ring. "Delacroix, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it before you answer." She watched water run down the windshield. "Everything I can do inside this hospital I've done. The consultation requests the notes going to Selby directly. The normal escalation dead ends at the same administration that just signed off on moving her evaluation up. That road isn't going to work fast enough, and it may not work at all. Then what road does... Your daughter needs to be looked at by someone who isn't inside this building's chain of authority. Someone who's dealt with disorders of consciousness and doesn't answer to Selby or to the people above him. She paused. Is there anyone in your network? Navy medicine, someone outside the VA system, someone you'd trust with this? The line was quiet for a long moment. She could hear the monitor in the background, running its steady, quiet line. There might be, the Admiral said at last. There's a woman I served alongside a long time ago. Situation I'm not cleared to describe. She got out and went into research. Neurology. Another pause, and something moved in his voice, the first crack she had ever heard in it. You understand what you're asking me to do. Go around the people who are supposed to be caring for my daughter. I understand exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking because I think the people caring for her have stopped looking, and I don't think she has time for me to be polite about it. She heard him breathe slow and controlled. Give me your number to pass along. I'll make the call tonight. She gave it. She sat in the car a while after the triage card out of her pocket and pressed flat against her sternum, and she made herself think about the thing she did not want to think about, which was the possibility that she was wrong. If all 19 documented responses were misreadings, artifacts the product of a woman who needed Junie Cho to be reachable because she had once watched a sailor come back, then the delay she was fighting for had a real cost. There were people on lists. There was a family somewhere waiting for the call that would come when a heart or a pair of kidneys became available. She let that be true. She held it for a full minute and did not flinch from it. Then she thought about the cluster response, 3 peaks rising amplitude structured interval tethered to a father's voice, and she started the car. The call came the next morning at 9:11 from an Oregon number she didn't have saved. She let her voice stay even. Delacroix. Dr. Marin Ashby. The voice on the other end carried the specific authority of a person who had spent decades being the most competent one in rooms full of competent people, and had stopped needing to signal it. Everett Cho gave me your number and forwarded the summary you built. I've read it twice. I want to talk. Are you free at noon, Treat? Yes. Dr. Marin Ashby turned out to be several things the name and the summary had not prepared her for. She was a neurologist. She had spent 14 years as a Navy physician attached to special operations, and the decade since running a research practice out of a university hospital in Portland, focused specifically on disorders of consciousness. She had published more than 40 papers. There were 2 assessment protocols used across VA hospitals that carried her name. She knew Everett Cho from a deployment she described only as complicated, and Reyes gathered had cost them both something. The call ran 24 minutes. Ashby asked questions that were specific and sequential and reflected a close reading of everything Reyes had sent. She asked about ambient conditions during the responses. She asked about lateralization, whether the responses favored one side of the body. She asked how the scheduled assessments lined up against the response windows. The responses cluster in low-stimulus familiar voice conditions, Reyes said. The assessment protocol runs in a controlled clinical environment with standardized stimuli. There's a structural mismatch. The protocol is built to strip out confounds, Ashby said. The trade-off is that it can strip out the signal it's supposed to detect. That's the whole problem with these cases. A pause. Nurse Delacroix. Your method is informal. Your observations are not careless. The pattern you've described is more consistent with a minimally conscious state than a vegetative one. And that distinction is not academic. Under federal guidelines, a patient who meets the criteria for minimal consciousness is not currently eligible for the donation process. Reyes kept her voice level. Can you assess her? I can be in Aldous in 3 hours if I take the early flight. The question is whether the hospital lets me in. A family can request an outside consultation, but the treating physician has to acknowledge it. Selby won't acknowledge it. Then we need someone with the authority to make him. Ashby said it without heat, a statement of terrain. This moves through official channels, or it gets dismissed on procedure, which makes it worse for her, not better. How long do we have? 11 days, maybe fewer. A breath on the line. Get me in that room, Delacroix. Whatever it takes inside the lines. Get me in. The call ended. Reyes sat in the third-floor break room with a vending machine sandwich going soft in front of her, and thought about the word procedural and what it meant when the procedure was moving faster than the truth. Down the hall, a monitor she was no longer allowed to touch was running a line that Warwick Selby had already called a machine error, and somewhere in Portland, a woman was checking flight times, and the clock on all of it had just 11 days left on it. What happened next did not go the way Reyes would have planned it if she had been given time to plan it carefully, and the hospital moved faster than she expected. At 2:40 that afternoon, a second notice went up in the record system. The donation assessment for Junie Cho had been advanced by another 4 days at the request of the transplant coordination team, pending final neurological sign-off. 7 days now. She was reviewing discharge paperwork on the 3rd floor when the flag came up. She read it, set the tablet down, and did not let her face do anything because the charge nurse was watching, and there was nothing to be gained by letting the building see the pressure land. She needed Priya. Not Priya's permission, Priya's knowledge of how paperwork actually moved through Cascade Ridge, which was a thing charge nurses carried that no one above them fully understood. She found her in the supply room and closed the door partway and gave her the clinical version dates and pattern and the name Marin Ashby and the phrase minimally conscious state, short and factual, watching the door the whole time. When she finished, Priya was quiet a long moment. You know what you're asking me to do. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what's happening so you have the information. That's a very thin line, Reyes. It's the one I've got. Priya looked at the shelves of saline and gauze as if the answer were filed there. Marin Ashby. I know that name. The VA protocols. She exhaled. If she submits a consultation request through the formal channel, the treating physician has to receive it and respond in writing. Selby can decline. But declining has to be documented and justified, which means it's a paper trail that doesn't disappear even when he says no. She looked back at Reyes. Have her send it directly from her practice to patient services, not through the Admiral. Patient services logs it regardless of what neurology does with it. Reyes let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Okay. Don't thank me. I didn't do anything. I know. I didn't ask you to. Priya made a sound that was not quite a laugh and opened the door and went back to running her floor. The consultation request from Dr. Marin Ashby hit patient services at 4:57 that afternoon. The Admiral texted when the confirmation came through. Reyes was mid-dressing change and didn't see it for 6 minutes, but when she did, she felt something settle. Not relief. Nothing that comfortable, just the sense of a door having been opened that would now take active effort to close. At 5:30, Selby came to the 3rd floor. She was at the station when he arrived, which she would decide later was either bad timing or the universe testing something. He came toward her without hesitation, and she understood before he reached her that the request had already made its way from patient services to his inbox, which meant the administrative response time was faster than Priya had implied it would be. The new charge nurse on the 3rd floor, a young man named Devon, found something urgent to do at the far end of the desk. The consultation request, Selby said, keeping his voice low and professional. I'm curious how Dr. Ashby came to have detailed information about my patient's case, given that you're no longer involved in that patient's direct care. I shared my personal nursing notes with the family. The family contacted Dr. Ashby on their own. You shared clinical documentation. I shared my handwritten observations. They're not hospital records. They're my notes on my own time." She paused. "The family has the right to seek an outside opinion. Dr. Ashby submitted through the proper channel. That process proceeds according to patient services protocol." Selby looked at her with the fully controlled, fully professional expression she had seen in his office, carrying something underneath that was no longer just managed irritation. "You're a nurse," he said, and his voice dropped to something quiet with an edge under it. "You have, 12 years of combined military and clinical experience. I won't pretend that's nothing. But you're not a neurologist. You're not a diagnostician. And you've spent 3 weeks taking a situation that is genuinely agonizing for a grieving father and using it to relitigate a decision qualified specialists made following evidence-based protocols." A pause. "That is not advocacy. That's interference, and it is doing real harm." She held his gaze. "If I'm wrong, a second assessment confirms your diagnosis, and the process moves forward. The family has the right to that confirmation. The process moving forward is what lets the transplant team save other lives. You understand that? There are people on waiting lists. This isn't only about one patient." "I understand what's at stake," she said, and kept her voice steady with some effort. "That's exactly why the diagnosis has to be right before the process moves forward." Silence. "Your employment status is under review," Selby said. "I want that clear. This is no longer a file notation. I've submitted a formal complaint to nursing administration." He let it sit. "For your own future, I'd step back from this." He left. Devon reappeared at the far end of the station as though he had never gone. Reyes picked up the next chart in her stack. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not, but that was internal, and no one at the station could see it. She stayed 20 minutes past shift on voluntary overtime finishing notes, and she was pulling on her coat when her phone rang. Ashby. The hospital declined the consultation request. Ashby said no preamble. "I received the formal response from the medical director's office 20 minutes ago. They cited the existing care team as sufficient, the completed assessment protocol, and a dry beat, concerns about the quality of the information the request was based on." Reyes closed her eyes. "The request was based on my notes. By implication, yes. The language is careful. It's what a person writes when they want to shut a door, without leaving a record that looks like they're shutting a door." Another pause. "I've dealt with this before. It's not unusual when an outside opinion threatens an institutional position. So it gets more complicated now, not less." "How much more complicated?" "I've already made a call. The Navy keeps a medical oversight function for cases involving active and retired personnel and their families, where there are concerns about adequate care. There's a captain named Dana Whitfield who handles this region. Everett Cho is a retired Rear Admiral. His daughter is the patient. That's squarely within Whitfield's mandate." A beat. "Everett made the decision. I placed the call on his behalf because he's sitting in that room, and I didn't want him carrying both at once." Reyes lowered herself slowly onto the break room chair. "You went to the Navy." "I went to the one authority in this situation that Warwick Selby cannot decline in writing. Whitfield is already reviewing the case documentation. If there's sufficient basis for concern, she can request a clinical review that doesn't route through the hospital's administrative channel. It goes through a different chain entirely." "How long?" "Days if it moves quickly. I'm pushing for quickly." A pause, and the voice changed slightly. Still not warm. It was not built for warmth, but not cold either. "Delacroix, I want to say something to you directly. What you've done for 3 weeks, the notes, the documentation staying with this, when the institution was pushing you out. That kind of longitudinal observation is undervalued clinically. In a case like this, it may be the most important data we have. I also want to be honest with you. The next few days will be the worst part. The hospital knows there's external pressure now, which means the internal pressure will get worse. Be ready for it. Do you have any support? A union rep, an advocate. I'll manage. A short silence. That's what I expected you to say. Something in the voice acknowledged it without endorsing it. Keep your phone on. Whitfield's office may reach you directly. The call ended. Reyes sat under the flickering break room light and thought again about the waiting lists because Selby had raised them, and he was not wrong to, and she was not the kind of person who could wave the weight of it away because it complicated her position. She let it be exactly as heavy as it was. Then she thought about the cluster on the monitor, 3 ascending peaks, and a father's voice, and she picked up her bag and walked out into the Oregon night, which smelled of rain and wet cedar, and faintly the diesel of a barge working the sound. Her phone buzzed. A different Oregon number. This is Captain Dana Whitfield, Navy Medical Oversight. I've reviewed the summary Dr. Ashby forwarded. I'm sending a representative to Cascade Ridge tomorrow at 0800. I'd like you present as a private individual, not in your nursing capacity. Bring your documentation. She read it 3 times. Then she looked up at the hospital 12 floors of lit windows against the black room, 407 somewhere in there, with a monitor running its quiet line, and an Admiral in a recliner, and a young woman the institution had decided was already gone. She typed back, I'll be there. She was in the visitor lot at 7:40, not the staff lot, because Whitfield had been specific, and she went through her documentation one more time, not because she had forgotten anything, but because going through it was the thing her hands needed to do while her head ran the scenarios. Captain Dana Whitfield was already in the lobby when Reyes came in at 7:58. She recognized the bearing before she registered anything else, a compact woman in her 50s. In civilian clothes, a dark blazer that said Federal without announcing it, silver threading close-cut black hair, and the posture of someone who had spent enough time in institutional buildings to own whatever space she stood in without appearing to try. 2 people flanked her, a woman with a briefcase and a lanyard, and a younger man taking in the layout of the building with the alert quality of someone trained to read a room on arrival. Whitfield crossed to her without hesitation. Delacroix. The handshake was direct. Dana Whitfield. This is Dr. Priya Nkamelu, Federal Medical Oversight, and Lieutenant Sam Okafor, my liaison. Walk me through the key points before we go up. 3 minutes. Verbally. Reyes gave it to her, concise, hitting the structural argument. The mismatch between scheduled protocol and unstructured observation, the pattern of responses in familiar voice conditions, the clinical distinction between vegetative and minimally conscious states, the accelerated timeline. She mentioned the cluster from 2 nights back. She mentioned the chapter, the one about the keeper's daughter coming back to the lighthouse. Whitfield listened without interrupting. When Reyes finished, she nodded once. Dr. Nkamelu. The woman opened her briefcase. Under the authority governing medical oversight for immediate family of retired flag officers, we can request a clinical hold on any scheduled procedure pending independent assessment review. The hold request was filed with the hospital's legal department at 06:45 this morning. Her voice was unbothered. It pauses the donation evaluation pending an independent neurological review. The hospital has 72 hours to comply or mount a formal legal challenge. They'll comply. The challenge route requires them to argue that an independent review constitutes undue clinical interference, which is a very high bar against a documented federal oversight request. Does Selby know? As of about 30 minutes ago, yes. Whitfield glanced at the elevator bank. Let's go up. What followed over the next several hours wasn't the confrontation Reyes had braced for. Confrontations have a shape. They escalate, peak resolve. What she watched instead was institutional pressure meeting federal authority, the way ground meets water, not dramatically, but without any point at which the ground had a real say in the matter. Whitfield's team went into the medical director's office. Reyes was asked to wait in the fourth-floor family consultation room, upholstered chairs and a box of tissues, and a window onto the parking structure, and she sat with her folder in her lap and waited. The Admiral came in at 8:40, looking like a man who had decided that not sleeping was no longer going to stop him from functioning. He sat across from her. "They told me about the hold. It buys time, not certainty. I understand the difference." He looked at her directly. "Why did you come back that night after they wrote you up, after they told you to stay away? You didn't have to." She thought about how to answer, because she mistrusted large explanations about her own motives, having found through experience that they were usually wrong. "I had a mentor. Navy. She used to say the most important thing a corpsman can do is stay in the room after everyone else has decided to leave." She looked at the window. "I've left rooms I shouldn't have. I try not to anymore when I can help it." The Admiral was quiet a moment. "Junie's mother left 3 years ago. Not passed. Left. It was probably the right call for her, but Junie took it hard. She was 21, and then, 8 months later, she was on that road." He looked at his hands. "The chapter I keep reading. The one where the keeper's daughter comes back after a year away. I started that book because it was the only thing in the gift shop with a character who did that." A pause. "I know how that sounds. It doesn't sound like anything I'd argue with," Reyes said. Dr. Ashby arrived at 9:20, 20 minutes behind her estimate because the shuttle had run late, and she had taken a cab from the regional airport. She came through the door with a rolling case and a tablet, and the focused energy of a person who had been working since before the flight, took off small and precise reading glasses shoved up into gray hair. She shook the Admiral's hand, sat opened the tablet. "The clinical hold is confirmed. I have a window to assess Junie at 1000. Selby doesn't approve it. The hold supersedes his authorization over the scheduling. He'll be present, which is standard, when an outside specialist assesses a current patient." She looked at Reyes over the glasses. "I want you in the room. As a documented observer in your capacity as the primary recorder of the behavioral observations. The hospital's legal team accepted it 40 minutes ago. You don't intervene. You don't speak unless addressed. You record. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good." At 1000 room, 407 held more people than it had in 4 months. Ashby at the bedside with a portable EEG, a calibrated auditory stimulus unit, and a structured behavioral checklist Reyes recognized as the coma recovery scale. Revised the standard for distinguishing vegetative from minimally conscious states. Okafor by the door. Dr. Ntkamelu with her briefcase. The Admiral at the window, arms at his sides. And Warwick Selby near the monitoring equipment, holding a folder of his prior assessments in both hands, with the grip of a man who had decided that paper was the only ground he had left to defend. Ashby did not acknowledge him when she came in. She acknowledged the patient. She set up the portable EEG with the practiced economy of someone who had done it hundreds of times, in worse conditions than a well-lit hospital room, and she explained each step to the Admiral in clear, brief language as she worked. Not because it was required, but because she understood that a family member in the room was part of the environment, and the environment mattered. Structured behavioral protocol, about 45 minutes. Auditory stimuli, direct verbal address, some light physical prompting. I need the room as quiet as possible, and I need you to stay where you are and not speak unless I ask. I may ask. The Admiral nodded. She began. Reyes stood to the right of the door and watched, and wrote brief and objective because her notes might end up in a formal record, and they needed to be clean. The first 15 minutes produced nothing that would move anyone. The standardized stimuli-calibrated sound, light touch, basic command prompts generated the same baseline Selby's assessments had. Reyes could feel his attention from across the room without looking at him. At 16 minutes, Ashby changed the protocol. She leaned close to Junie's ear and said her name. First name only, in a conversational register. Not the neutral assessment voice, but the voice of a person actually addressing another person. The EEG line moved. Small. A brief lift in cortical activity, left hemisphere gone in under 4 seconds. Ashby noted it and continued. At 23 minutes, she turned to the Admiral. "I'd like you to read." "Do you have the book?" He had it in his jacket, which told her everything about what kind of man he was. He produced it without fumbling, already open to the page. "Start at the top of whatever page you're on. Normal reading voice, the way you always do it." He cleared his throat once and began. Reyes watched the EEG. At 40 seconds, the line shifted, and it was not small. The left hemisphere showed a response that built over 80 seconds and then plateaued rather than dropping back, the shape of something processing rather than simply reacting. Selby stepped forward. "The sensitivity settings on portable units can produce false..." "Dr. Selby." Ashby's voice did not rise. It simply became a thing you did not interrupt again. "I'll address your observations after the assessment is complete. Please wait." He stopped. The Admiral kept reading. At 2 minutes 14 seconds, Junie Cho's left hand moved. Not a twitch, her fingers extended, index and middle lifting fractionally off the blanket, and then curled slowly back, deliberate, in a way there was no clinical language sufficient for only the language of recognition, which was the language Reyes had been writing in her notes for 3 weeks, and was not going to say out loud in this room. Ashby logged it and the EEG reading with it, and asked the Admiral to stop. He stopped mid-sentence. The room went very quiet. "Junie." Ashby's voice normal. "If you can hear me, I want you to try to move your left hand." 3 seconds. 5. The fingers moved again. The same motion. Extend, curl, release. Slower this time and unmistakable. The monitor logged a sustained spike. Selby made a sound. Not a word. A breath close to the sound a person makes when the ground they were standing on has shifted without warning. Ashby straightened. She looked at the readout for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at Selby across the room, an expression that was completely neutral and carried the weight of 40 published papers and 14 years of Navy medicine behind it. "This patient is demonstrating command-following behavior. That places her outside the vegetative category and within the criteria for a minimally conscious state. Under federal guidelines, she is not currently eligible for the donation process." A pause. "I'll have a written assessment to Captain Whitfield's office by end of day." The Admiral had put the book down. He was looking at his daughter's hand. Reyes did not move from her spot by the door, but her right hand had found the triage card in her breast pocket, and she was holding it flat against her chest, and she was counting her own breaths down the way Nadia Okonkwo had taught her a lifetime ago on a boat in the dark, because there was a great deal of feeling in the room right now, and she intended to keep hers exactly where it belonged, which was inside where no one could use it against the record. Then, from somewhere down the corridor, a code alarm began, low and sustained, and it was not a drill, and it was coming from the east wing 20 meters from where they stood. Reyes was moving before she consciously decided to, the way she always moved toward an alarm, her body doing the math, before her head caught up. Room 4, East 19. She saw it through the doorway before she reached it. A young man, mid-20s, out of the bed and on the floor, which was wrong, and 2 nurses doing the right things. One on the phone for rapid response, one trying to position him. But it was not a fall, and it was not simple. He was in cardiac arrest. She was through the door before the thought finished. "Move," she said to the nearest nurse, not harshly, just in the register that left no room, and the nurse moved, and Reyes went down beside the patient and started compressions. 9 years of Navy medicine had built a specific quality into her hands, harder and faster than hospital-trained CPR. Less hesitation about the force required, because in the field, You learned that too gentle saves no one, and that bruised ribs are a problem you can have later. She found the rhythm at once, and counted in her head, and nowhere else. She was aware of the doorway. She was aware that people had gathered in the corridor, and that the group included Whitfield and Nkemelu, and a little behind them, Warwick Selby, who had been walking toward the administrative wing and stopped when the alarm sounded. She did not look at any of them. The defibrillator card arrived at 90 seconds. Good time, she noted, and filed it. She did not stop compressions until the pads were placed and the unit confirmed contact, and then she came off with both hands up in the clean gesture that set out of the circuit. The first shock went at 2 minutes 11. The rhythm on the monitor shifted not immediately. It took a second shock and a dose of epinephrine from a resident who arrived breathing hard off the stairs, but at 3 minutes 22 from the onset of her intervention, the monitor showed a sinus rhythm thready too fast and absolutely present. The resident looked at the monitor at the patient at Reyes. Good compressions. It was the compliment of someone who understood the technical reality of what had just happened and needed something to say. He needs the cath lab. That presentation, the rate the way he dropped, get cardiology down here. He was already on the phone. Reyes stood, and her knees hurt from the floor in the abstract way of peripheral information. You would process later, and she looked at the young man being moved onto the gurney by people who were trained for it and doing it right, and on his forearm half covered by the sensor lid, she saw a unit tattoo she recognized. She thought of Boyd and of the machinist's mate from Ohio, and of every stretcher she had ever stood, over not knowing which way the next hours would go. And she felt the same stripped-down, quiet intensity she always felt in that moment, which had no name she had ever found. She turned. The corridor had a crowd in it now, responding staff visitors. The administrator materialized from somewhere Whitfield's team, and Selby standing to the left of the doorway, with his documentation folder hanging at his side, and an expression on his face she had never seen there before. Not anger, not admiration. Some specific configuration of a man looking at evidence he did not want to deal with. The Admiral had come down the hall. He looked at her, the way a man recalibrates carefully, completely, without letting the recalibration show. Then he spoke with the economy of a man who chose words the way he chose everything. "Where did you learn to do that?" She almost said the practical thing. The Navy. Field medicine. But what came out was the truth, which was simpler. "I wasn't always a nurse. Before this, I was a corpsman. 9 years. You learn to move fast when the ship's surgeon is 40 minutes out and there is no ship's surgeon." She paused. "You learn there's no such thing as later." Whitfield had come to stand just behind him, reading Reyes the way a person reads terrain. Selby had not moved. He was looking at the supply sheet Reyes had grabbed on instinct and marked with compression start and shock, times-old corpsman habit entirely redundant in a building with this level of documentation, but her hands had done it anyway. He was looking at it the way he had looked at her notes in his office, like a man being told something he did not want to believe, and finding it harder not to believe than he had expected. She picked up the sheet, handed the Times to the resident's colleague, doing the formal event log, and looked at Selby. "The EEG from this morning," she said level. "Ashby's portable unit. I'd like you to look at it again. Not to change your mind, just to look at it. Whatever you conclude, you should be the one who looked." Selby was quiet. His folder hung at his side. "I've spent 9 years. "I know," she said. "That's not what I said." He looked at her a long moment, something working in his face she did not try to read. Then he looked past her toward the elevator, where the gurney had gone, and his jaw tightened, and he turned and walked the other way. The days after moved the way institutional investigations move, exhausting and not in a straight line. Whitfield's office located a pattern in the neurology department's donation cases, going back years, and it did not stop at Selby. There was a transplant coordinator, a man named Curtis Vance, whose professional development funding traced back to a foundation whose donor list included the surgical group that was Cascade Ridge's designated recipient facility, an indirect but documented financial relationship, and Selby had sat on the committee that approved that funding for 7 years. Ashby, pulling archived EEG data from 2 prior cases, found response clusters in the raw files that had never appeared in Selby's signed reports. And a junior physician who had flagged an anomaly on a 3rd case 18 months earlier, been overruled by Selby, and resigned 6 weeks later, turned out to have kept a 31-page personal record of the whole thing on a drive she had never deleted. Her name was Dr. Yael Ostrander, and she agreed to testify within 20 minutes of Whitfield's team reaching her. It was Boyd who filled in the last quiet corner of it. In his weeks drifting through the edges of the hospital, sleeping some nights, in the ER waiting room, he had watched Vance come and go, had seen which families the man sat with, and how and when Whitfield's liaison canvassed the ER staff. A triage nurse mentioned the veteran Delacroix had sent for a hot meal, and Boyd, tracked down at the shelter on Cedar Street, turned out to be a careful, unhurried witness, with a memory sharpened by a lifetime of having to notice things to survive them. He was not the case. He was one true detail in it, which was all anyone is ever asked to be. Selby's license was suspended, then permanently revoked by the state board. Vance was charged. The hospital issued a public acknowledgement that named Reyes Delacroix in a single sentence as the nursing staff member whose documented observations initiated the review. One sentence which was a document, and public, and accurate, and enough. The performance notation was expunged. Priya Alvarez, who volunteered to run the training when the new observation escalation protocol went live, brought her a coffee from the good machine and said in her oblique way that she had told Reyes to drop it and had to sit with that. And Reyes said she had told her through proper channels when it mattered which was true and which counted. Junie Cho said her first word 8 weeks after the clinical hold on a Tuesday at 8:13, while the Admiral was reading the Lighthouse chapter for what Reyes guessed was the 17th time. It was a single syllable, "Dad so quiet." He had to ask the rehab nurse if he had really heard it, and she said yes, and he put the book down and did not pick it up for several minutes. Recovery was long and non-linear after that setbacks that were real weeks that tested everyone. But Junie was there, which was the word Ashby had used, and which stayed the right one. Months later, she asked her father who the nurse was the one who did not leave, and he told her the name and said she wanted to meet her when she was ready. Dr. Marin Ashby built a curriculum for military and civilian nursing staff on longitudinal behavioral observation in disorders of consciousness and cited a collection of handwritten notes from Cascade Ridge Regional as its clinical foundation and asked Reyes to co-develop it. And when Reyes started to argue that her notes were not a methodology, they were just what she did, Ashby said that was exactly why they needed to exist, in a form other nurses could use for other patients, in other rooms. Reyes agreed to Thursday because Ashby had a call with the division on Friday, and because she had, if she was honest, already started building it in her head. She did not think of herself as someone who had won something. She thought about the 2 prior families who had known in the body-level way people know things, that something was wrong, and had been handed the language of certainty by someone with all the institutional authority, and had accepted it. Because what else do you do when the expert tells you the answer is final? You find someone who stays in the room and keeps looking. She thought about Yael Ostrander, who had carried 31 pages alone for 16 months, and about how it had gone well only because there had been an Admiral in the next chair, and an Ashby at the end of a phone, and a Whitfield with the authority to create a hold, and about how in a different building with different coincidences, it might have gone nowhere at all. That was the part she could not resolve, and had stopped trying to. On a Wednesday in the 5th month, she passed a group of neurology residents in the lobby, and one of them, the one who asked good questions, said, Nurse Delacroix, I read your notes, the originals in Ashby's proposal. I just wanted you to know I read them. And Reyes understood that the reading had done some small adjustment in how that resident would look at the next patient, whose inconsistency the protocol did not catch, and she said, "Good. That's what they're for," and went out into the evening. The rain had let up. Down past the mill, a barge horn sounded once across the sound, low and long, and it went through her the way it always did, and she let it. She put her bag on the passenger seat, where the old notebook used to sit before it, became part of a federal file, and then a curriculum document. She had a new one now, same kind, wire-bound, nothing special 3 weeks in. The first entry described a patient on the 3rd floor, showing a response she wanted to watch for a week before drawing any conclusion. She was drawing no conclusion yet. She was staying in the room. This is the thing nobody tells you about doing the right thing inside a place that does not want you to. It is not brave the way bravery gets described. It is not one clean moment of courage. It is a run of small decisions made in corridors and break rooms and parking structures, each one only slightly harder than the last. Each one held up by nothing more dramatic than the refusal to accept that what you saw wasn't real because someone with more authority said it wasn't. The rooms will always ask you to leave. The only question is what you do after the door closes. Reyes Delacroix Corman, who they called Kilo 6, on a boat a long way from Oregon, pressed a worn triage card flat against her chest one more time and started the car and drove the mill road home with 19 miles of wet dark ahead of her and used every one of them. If Reyes taught you anything tonight, let it be this: the past doesn't break the people who refuse to stop looking, it sharpens them. She stayed in the room when everyone else had left, and a young woman came home because of it. If this story moved, you take a second to like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments, drop your city, so I can see how far this traveled. And answer me this: if the whole building had already decided and you were the only one who saw it, would you have had the nerve to stay in the room